I got involved in it myself last year. It's terribly difficult. And to think that you'd have enough state ballots at your disposal that you'd be able to get 270 electoral votes and therefore theoretically win the presidency is extremely difficult. So, 2008, how many candidates would that have been? How many candidates would have been on the stage at the national debate had that criteria been applied? 5. The two majors, Ron Paul, Ralph Nader, and Chuck Baldwin. Those 5. But guess who heads up the Presidential Debate Commission, who makes the decision as to who gets invited to the presidential debates? Anybody know? The former chairman of the Republican and Democratic parties. Duh. Hence, I go back to what I said at the beginning. The problem in America is the American people have not heard the message of constitutional government. Now, I'm telling you, there is no hope in Washington, D.C. The longer we keep focusing on Washington politics, the more hopeless and helpless we become. They want us fixated on Washington. Mr. Glenn Beck, please, sir, quit telling us what's going on in Washington, D.C. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Elect who you will. The corruption is so deep and so pervasive, there is no hope there. Mr. Limbaugh, there is no hope there. Mr. O'Reilly, there is no hope there. Mr. Hannity, there is no hope there. Why do you keep fixating on Washington, D.C.? Our founding fathers were remarkable in many ways. Not only did they create the checks and balances of the federal government, 3 separate and equal branches of government, that is the executive, the judicial, and the legislative, in order to protect the liberties of the people. But knowing the propensity of those in power to renege their responsibility to preserve and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, and not trusting people in Washington, D.C., the Founding Fathers also added another check and balance to the entire system, without which freedom would come crashing down and constitutional government would be quickly evaporated. I remind you, my dear friends, in 1787, whenever that Constitution was finally adopted, not one single colony surrendered its independence. When Jefferson wrote in the Constitution that these states ought and by right are free and independent states, he meant it.
Right.
We are not in the strict definition. Now, don't misconstrue what I'm about to say. Read the Federalist Papers, read the Anti-Federalist Papers, read the writings of the Founding Fathers, read John Locke, read the writers that the Founding Fathers read. In strict terms, we are not one nation. This is not a government. This is a confederacy, a confederation of states that have acceded to the central government certain, under the Constitution, certain responsibilities. But at no time did the states, in adopting the U.S. Constitution, ever abandon their own autonomy, their own independence, their own liberty. It is the states that are the bulwark of freedom in America. why I said at the beginning, God is doing something in Montana. There's something happening in this state. I think there's a few other states that are also seeing a mighty movement of freedom that's beginning to envelop their states. But there is no question that Montana is at the cutting edge of what I'm talking about here. It's one of the reasons why I'm here tonight. Because I believe that's what's happening in Montana, what's happening in Hamilton, Montana, is more important than what's happening in Washington, D.C. Who cares what the federal Supreme Court says? Who cares what Congress says? Who cares what Barack Obama said? Without the approbation of the states, the governors, the legislature, the Senate, the courts, the sheriffs, it doesn't mean diddly squat. The federal government has no power over you whatsoever, unless your governor, your state legislatures, your own courts, and your own sheriffs approve their tyranny. When that revolution began in 1775, with those shots fired, heard around the world, it was because they understood the independence and the autonomy of the sovereign states. And they were not willing to allow any federal or centralized government usurp the God-given freedoms that they recognize in their states. Let me tell you, show you how some things can work here. Let me just give you some real practical examples of what I'm talking about. How many remember the name Judge Roy Moore? Ten Commandments judge. You got the Ten Commandments in there. Chief Justice Supreme Court in Alabama, a good friend of mine. I was with him up there in Montgomery when all that trial was taking place. I had prayer with him and his staff the day of the trial, right before they went out and heard the verdict. I was there throughout that whole process. I'm friends of the governor that preceded the current governor of Alabama that allowed this judge to maintain the integrity of his office against federal encroachment. The then governor of Alabama said to the federal government, if you think for 1 minute you are going to deny Judge Roy Moore his right in Alabama to post a copy of the Ten Commandments in his courtroom, you have another thing coming. He said, as governor of the state of Alabama, if I have to, I will call out the state police and they will personally guard Chief Justice Roy Moore, and no one will be allowed to remove those commandments from his courtroom. So what did the federal government do? It sent Karl Rove to Alabama to promote the candidacy of Judge Moore's opponent, to try to remove him from office through the election process. In the same time, they sent Karl Rove to Alabama to work against Fob James' opponent to remove him as governor. Republican, pro-life, Christian president, sending his own top envoy to Alabama to be sure that Fob James was not